One small boy interrupted a Sunday service, and in doing so asked a question that left an entire church speechless, as pastors, parents, and even Elon Musk watched in awe. What he said next would ripple across the world. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. It was a peaceful Sunday morning at Elevation Church. Warm sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft patterns across rows of pews filled with families and visitors. Gentle worship music filled the air, blending with the low murmur of conversation as people found their seats. Pastor Steven Furtick stood on stage, mid-sermon, his voice passionate as he spoke about how faith often emerges from the most unexpected places. His words stirred the congregation, who leaned forward, drawn in by his energy and conviction. Suddenly, a soft creak echoed from the side door near the front of the sanctuary. Heads turned slightly, curious but unconcerned. Then, from the doorway, a small figure appeared. A boy, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, stepped into the room. He wore a simple blue t-shirt and jeans, but what caught everyone's attention was his posture. He walked with a quiet confidence, his chin lifted slightly, eyes scanning the room with purposeful intensity. Pastor Furtick noticed immediately. His words faltered for half a second as he watched the boy move steadily down the center aisle. There was no sign of panic, no hesitation. It was as if the child belonged there, drawn by something greater than curiosity. A few congregation members exchanged puzzled glances, whispering softly. Still, the boy pressed forward, unwavering. Pastor Furtick took a calming breath and smiled, keeping his tone welcoming. He sensed instinctively that this was no ordinary interruption. Something unusual, perhaps even sacred, was unfolding before them. The sanctuary, moments before buzzing with casual Sunday energy, grew still. Every eye turned toward the small boy making his way toward the stage, while the warm light from the windows seemed to follow him like a silent, unseen spotlight. And in that quiet, something extraordinary was about to begin. The boy stopped a few feet from the stage, lifting his small hand and pointing directly at Pastor Steven Furtick. His voice, clear and unwavering, filled the sanctuary. "I came to ask a question," he said. A hush fell over the room. Pastor Furtick, smiling gently, motioned for a coordinator to bring a portable microphone. Kneeling slightly to the boy's level, he handed it to him. "Of course, young man," Pastor Furtick said warmly. "What would you like to ask?" The boy took the mic with both hands, pausing only briefly before speaking again, his words ringing with sincerity. "Why do some people believe in things they can't see, and others only believe what they can touch?" There was a ripple through the congregation, a collective intake of breath. A few phones lifted discreetly into the air as visitors began recording the moment. Somewhere in the tech booth, a producer signaled to start a live stream backup, sensing something extraordinary unfolding. Pastor Furtick straightened slowly, taken aback by the depth of the question. Around the room, social media notifications began buzzing. Tweets and video clips were already starting to circulate, carrying the boy's innocent but profound question far beyond the church walls and into the waiting world. In the quiet pause that followed the boy's profound question, it became clear that this was no accident. This moment had been shaped by a lifetime of small conversations, fostered under the careful guidance of his father, Elon Musk. Elon had always believed that children should be taught not what to think, but how to think. At home, he encouraged X to ask hard questions about everything, from the stars in the sky to the meaning of life itself. No subject was off limits. Science, philosophy, faith, they were all open fields for exploration. From a young age, X would sit on his father's lap as Elon pointed out constellations, explaining how galaxies formed, how light traveled across unimaginable distances. But inevitably, X's questions grew deeper. Why are we here? He would ask. Is there something bigger than the stars? These weren't rehearsed conversations. They were natural expressions of a mind reaching out for something greater than just evidence and logic. In recent months, Elon had noticed a shift. Their discussions often turned to ideas that no telescope or rocket could explain. Questions about belief, about faith, about the possibility that truth might sometimes exist beyond what could be proven. Elon, though deeply rooted in science, never dismissed these questions. Instead, he told X the truth, that some of the most important things in life, like love, hope, and meaning, couldn't be measured or tested but were real nonetheless. It was during one of these late-night talks that the seeds of today's question were planted. Sitting side by side, looking up at the endless sky, X had asked, "Why do some people believe in things they can't see and others don't?" Elon had smiled thoughtfully, realizing his son was touching on one of the greatest mysteries of human experience. Now, standing before a packed church, with lights, cameras, and the world starting to watch, X wasn't seeking attention. He was simply doing what he had been taught to do: ask the biggest, bravest questions he could, and trust that somewhere, somehow, the search for answers mattered. Pastor Steven Furtick smiled warmly as he knelt slightly, leveling his gaze with the young boy who stood so bravely before hundreds of watchful eyes. "That's a wonderful question, X," he said, his voice steady through the microphone. "Faith is believing in something we know is real, even when we can't always see it or touch it. Kind of like love." X furrowed his brow, thinking hard. His small hands gripped the microphone a little tighter. "I can't see love," he said slowly, "but I know my dad loves me." His words echoed through the sanctuary, striking something deep within everyone present. A ripple of emotion moved through the congregation. Whispers, soft sighs, the discreet wiping of tears. Even the most stoic among them felt the simplicity and truth in the boy's realization. Pastor Furtick nodded. "Exactly, X. Love is invisible, but you feel it. You know it's there because it shows up in actions, in how people treat you. Faith works in a similar way. It's trusting in something good and real, even when you can't always see the proof with your eyes." For a moment, the boy was quiet, as if absorbing every word. Then, tilting his head slightly, he asked the next question, one that made the air in the room tighten with tension. "But if faith is about good things," X said carefully, "why do people fight about what they believe?" The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Phones stopped recording for a beat as the weight of the child's words settled over the room. Pastor Furtick took a slow breath. He could feel the challenge in the question, not just for himself, but for everyone present. "That's another wise question, X," he said, choosing his words with care. "Sometimes, people get so attached to being right about what they believe that they forget the purpose of their belief in the first place. They let pride get in the way. They forget that faith is supposed to make us kinder, more understanding, not angry, or divided." X listened intently, swinging his legs a little from where he sat on the edge of a chair near the stage. "So it's not the believing that's bad," he said thoughtfully. "It's the fighting." "Exactly," Pastor Furtick replied, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Belief should bring people together. It should remind us to love, to listen, to help each other. But when people use their beliefs to hurt or judge others, they miss the whole point." The boy nodded slowly, as if storing the answer somewhere deep inside his heart. The congregation was utterly still, hanging onto every word exchanged between the seasoned pastor and the courageous child. It wasn't just a cute moment anymore. It was a mirror held up to every adult sitting there, forcing them to confront the ways their own pride or fear might have built walls instead of bridges. Pastor Furtick looked out at the crowd, seeing the emotion on so many faces. He knew they weren't just hearing the boy. They were feeling the truth in his innocent, unfiltered questions. And in that moment, a gentle shift began within the sanctuary. Walls built by years of hardened certainty and quiet divisions seemed, for a breath, a little less tall, and X, unaware of the ripple he had set in motion, simply sat, swinging his legs, waiting for the next answer in his search for something real. X shifted in his chair, adjusting the microphone with his small hands. He looked out over the sea of faces and said, almost in a whisper, "Jesus said to forgive people, but even grown-ups can't do it." The words hung heavy in the sanctuary. Pastor Furtick leaned forward slightly, giving X his full attention. "You're right," he said gently. "Forgiveness is one of the hardest things for people to do, even though it's one of the most important things Jesus taught." X nodded seriously, as if he had already thought about this deeply. "One time," he began, "a boy at my school took my toy rocket. It was my favorite one. I was really, really mad." Several people in the congregation smiled sympathetically. They could already imagine the pain in a little boy's heart over something he loved being taken away. "But then," X continued, "I remembered something Jesus said. He said to forgive people, not just once, but lots of times." He held up his small hands, trying to count. "Like 70 times 7. A soft murmur of recognition spread through the church. Many knew the passage he was referencing. It wasn't rehearsed, it was real, coming from a child's memory and a child's heart. "So," X said, his voice growing a little stronger, "I went back to school the next day, and instead of being mean to him, I let him play with it again. And now, we're friends." Silence swept the room. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that meant every adult sitting there had just been challenged in the most unexpected and profound way. A simple story about a toy rocket had exposed something many carried quietly. Grudges, bitterness, old wounds left unforgiven. Pastor Furtick felt his throat tighten. He placed a hand over his heart and said, "Thank you, X, for reminding us what real forgiveness looks like. It's not complicated, but it is courageous." The congregation responded with a soft wave of applause, not for performance, but for the truth that had just been spoken by the smallest voice in the room. Off to the side of the sanctuary, the service coordinator caught Pastor Furtick's eye and gave a subtle signal. The nanny had found X and was standing by with a look of worried relief. They were ready to retrieve him if needed. But Pastor Furtick shook his head gently. Not yet. Something bigger was happening. This was no accident. This moment was unfolding exactly the way it was meant to. He turned back to X, who now looked up at him with the open, fearless gaze only a child could offer. "Would you like to share anything else with us?" Pastor Furtick asked, giving him the space to continue. Meanwhile, unseen by many in the sanctuary, clips of the conversation were already flooding social media. Smartphones recorded from every angle. Comments exploded online. Hashtags trended. Faith leaders and media outlets scrambled to react. In homes, coffee shops, even in other churches, people tuned in live, captivated by the purity and honesty unfolding at Elevation Church. Back on stage, X shrugged, swinging his legs again. "I just think forgiving is better than fighting," he said simply. "Because if you don't forgive, you stay mad forever. And then you miss all the fun." The congregation laughed softly through their tears. It was the kind of laughter that came from deep release, the kind that washed away the heavy burdens they'd carried for too long. Pastor Furtick looked out over the faces in the sanctuary, some smiling, some weeping, and he thought to himself, "Today a child has preached the most powerful sermon I could ever give." And somewhere beyond the church walls, millions were already beginning to feel the same. X swung his legs thoughtfully, studying the faces in the crowd. He gripped the microphone a little tighter, then spoke again, his voice clear and sincere. "Jesus said, it's hard for rich people to go to heaven. A ripple moved through the congregation. People shifted in their seats, exchanging glances. X wasn't finished. "And my dad," he continued, glancing toward the back of the church where Elon Musk had quietly entered minutes earlier, standing discreetly near the door. "Has lots of money." Pastor Furtick inhaled sharply, catching the weight of the moment. He saw Elon tense slightly, folding his arms as if bracing against a truth that had landed with unexpected force. It wasn't accusation in X's voice, only innocence. But sometimes the purest observations cut deeper than any sermon. The sanctuary fell into a hushed stillness. Pastor Furtick rose slowly from his chair, walking a few steps closer to X so they stood side by side. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, grounding the moment with calm. "You know, X," he said thoughtfully, "Jesus did say that. He said it's hard because sometimes when people have a lot, it's easy to start trusting their money more than trusting God. But having wealth isn't the problem. It's what you do with it that matters." X's brow furrowed. He was listening intently. "Jesus taught us that everything we have," Pastor Furtick continued, "whether it's money, talents, or time, is meant to serve others, to help, to lift people up. That's what makes riches into blessings instead of burdens." In the back of the room, Elon stood motionless. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on his son, who was soaking in every word. X thought for a moment, swinging his legs again. Then he said, almost in a whisper but loud enough for the microphone to carry, "You can't take money to space or heaven." The simplicity of it struck the room like a bell. Soft gasps, then a complete silence. There was no need for interpretation, no elaborate theological debate. A 5-year-old had just summed up what countless sermons had tried to teach. Pastor Furtick swallowed the lump rising in his throat. Around the room, grown men and women wiped at their eyes. Some looked down, convicted. Others looked up, searching for answers. He knelt slightly to be more at X's level. "You're right, buddy," he said softly. "No rocket, no spaceship, no technology. Nothing we build can carry our treasures beyond this life. But what we give away, the love we show, the kindness, the forgiveness, the way we lift others up, those things last forever." X smiled shyly, sensing he had said something important, even if he didn't fully grasp how deeply it had landed. Pastor Furtick stood and addressed the congregation. His voice was thick with emotion. "Sometimes it takes the honesty of a child to remind us that the things we chase can never fill the place that was made for love, faith, and generosity. And maybe," he said, glancing back at Elon, who had now stepped forward a few cautious paces, "maybe the ones we think are here to be taught are really here to teach us." The congregation remained silent, reverent, the truth of the moment settling deep into every heart. Saw authentic hope beyond default. At that instant, it wasn't about fame or wealth or technology. It was about a father, a son, and a church full of people witnessing something real, something rare. The piercing honesty of a child exposing the hunger of a world desperate for meaning beyond success. And as the light streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating the small figure on stage, more than one person quietly resolved to rethink what they valued most. X shifted slightly in his seat, his small hands gripping the microphone once again. His face was earnest, thoughtful, as if he carried more on his heart than anyone expected. "I know a story about Jesus," he said, his voice soft but clear enough to reach every corner of the sanctuary. Pastor Furtick smiled encouragingly, nodding for him to continue. "It's the one where some men brought a woman to Jesus because she did something wrong," X explained, searching the faces before him as if making sure they were really listening. They wanted to throw rocks at her. The congregation leaned in closer, drawn in by the simplicity and depth of his retelling. "But Jesus said, only people who never did anything wrong could throw a rock," X continued. "And nobody could because Everybody does wrong things. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. So everyone left, he finished simply. And Jesus told the woman she wasn't bad anymore. He told her to live better. Pastor Furtick felt his throat tighten. He could see grown men wiping their eyes, women clasping hands together at their chests. The story, in X's innocent retelling, carried a clarity that stripped away years of theological complication and debate. X wasn't finished. He looked up again, his voice even softer, yet somehow stronger. "Sometimes people throw rocks at my dad," he said, glancing back briefly toward Elon, who stood quietly just inside the door. "Not real ones, but words, on the internet. They say bad things even when they don't know him." The sanctuary fell completely silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down like a gentle, undeniable truth. Pastor Furtick stepped closer, his heart heavy with the reality the boy had named. He placed a reassuring hand on X's shoulder. "X," he said warmly, "you're right. Real faith, real love, doesn't throw stones. It doesn't judge without compassion. It sees the brokenness in all of us and chooses to heal, not to hurt." X nodded solemnly, clearly understanding more than most his age, or most adults, ever could. Across the country, the ripple effect of that moment had already begun. Clips of the service flooded social media feeds. Headlines flashed across news networks. Faith leaders issued public statements praising the boy's wisdom. Atheists and skeptics, too, found themselves moved by the child's simple honesty, sharing the moment as a reminder of the better parts of human nature. Families around kitchen tables paused to discuss the meaning of grace and forgiveness. Pastors rewrote sermons. Teachers discussed it with students. People who had walked away from faith years ago stopped to reconsider, if only for a moment. In a world so often divided by judgment, by harshness, by cynicism, it was the small, unguarded voice of a child that reminded millions of something forgotten. That true strength is found not in condemnation but in mercy. That the hand we raise should not be to harm but to lift. And that maybe, just maybe, hearts could still be changed by the simplest truths, spoken with childlike faith. As the final notes of the worship music faded and people began to gather their things, Pastor Steven Furtick approached X and Elon with a warm, hopeful smile. "We're holding a special Q&A session for anyone who wants to stay and talk about today's message," he said. "You're both welcome, if you'd like." X looked up at his father with pleading eyes. Elon chuckled softly and nodded. "We'll stay." Word spread quickly. Dozens decided to remain, filling the sanctuary with a hum of anticipation. A few folding chairs were set up casually near the front, but the atmosphere felt less like a formal event and more like a gathering of old friends. Scientists, artists, believers, skeptics, people from all walks of life leaned in, ready to explore faith, doubt, and truth together. One of the first to speak was a woman in her 30s, her voice slightly shaky with emotion. "I'm a physicist," she said. "For years I thought I had to choose between science and faith. But today you both showed me maybe I don't have to." She smiled directly at X, who swung his legs gently from the chair and smiled back shyly. "Thank you for asking brave questions," she added, her voice steady now. "You reminded me that real truth doesn't fear honest searching." Elon reached over and squeezed X's shoulder proudly. Around the room, people nodded, many visibly moved. The conversations that followed were rich, heartfelt, and often unexpected. People discussed the mysteries of the universe, the longing for purpose, the power of forgiveness, and the undeniable ache for something greater than themselves. Pastor Furtick stood back for a moment, watching it unfold. He realized with a quiet certainty that none of this had been an accident. Not X's arrival, not the profound honesty of his questions, not the convergence of so many different lives today. This was something deeper, something orchestrated beyond human planning, a divine appointment. The impact of this day, Pastor Furtick knew, would ripple far beyond these walls. It would move through the scientists who found space for wonder again, the skeptics who dared to believe in goodness, the parents who would have new conversations with their children. And maybe, just maybe, a little boy's simple, fearless faith would help heal a world too often divided by fear and pride. As the evening light poured through the stained glass windows, casting soft colors across the pews, Elon and X walked out of the church hand in hand. Their steps were unhurried, their connection undeniable. Around them, the quiet buzz of conversations continued, but for them, it was a simple shared peace, born not from answers, but from the willingness to ask. The final image lingers, a father and son, side by side, stepping into a world forever changed by one child's fearless questions. A gentle voiceover echoes above the closing scene. Sometimes, the biggest changes start with the smallest questions. If this inspiring story moved your heart, subscribe now for more journeys into faith, family, and the courage to believe again. Together, let's rediscover the beauty of honest searching and the hope that still lights the way.